Well, I think ultimately the whole goal here is to attract more people to our industry. Some studies have been done that suggest that the vast majority of people, and I've heard a number as high as 90% of people who can afford to fly private have never flown private. And so if that's true, why is that? And I think the answer is that to this point, accessing this industry is a little confusing. Who do I work with? What do I do? Am I really a private aviation prospect or a customer? How do I integrate this into my travel patterns? Am I really ready to go from not flying private to a very broad and expensive approach? And where are those people sitting today? Well, I think they're sitting in the front of the cabin at places like Delta Airlines and elsewhere. We're trying to introduce the idea of sensible private aviation travel. And those are two words you don't often hear in the same sentence, but there are use cases and trips where it makes sense to select a private aviation alternative for certain customers.
Welcome to The Vertical Space, the podcast at the intersection of technology and flight, featuring deep dives with innovators, early adopters, and industry leaders. We are your hosts, Jim Barry from Celerity 05 and Peter Shannon and Luka Tomjanovich from Radius Capital. At Celerity 05, we believe that breakthrough air transportation capabilities come from leveraging current and emerging technologies, and that companies achieve profitability through relevant technologies, strong teams, and a deep understanding of the aviation market. Connect with global aviation experts at celerity05.com for feedback and recommendations to chart your path to success. At Radius Capital, we invest in early-stage deep tech that redefines what is possible in aerospace. We partner with founders building next-generation aerospace capabilities, from advanced design and development tools to the digital transformation of the flight environment, novel use cases and forms of flight, and the software and systems that make them possible. If this describes you, reach out. We're excited to connect. All right, let's dive in.
Hey everybody, welcome back to The Vertical Space in our conversation with George Mattson, Chief Executive Officer of Wheels Up. So George brings a CEO's perspective to running a large aviation company. We start our conversation around the Wheels Up vision as an aviation solutions company and listen to how he believes this is unique in the industry. George then provides an overview of the private aviation industry, its opportunities and challenges. We then discuss his Wheels Up experience, coming over for many years on the board of directors of Delta Airlines, who have a sizable investment in Wheels Up. Listen to their vision of the integrated customer experience, tying together commercial and private aviation for their combined customers. And I'm sure you'll ask why this hasn't been done before. We asked the same question in our discussion. And then something we always like to discuss with CEOs, what's it like being a CEO and the CEO of an aviation company, what he focuses on, a day in the life, and his expectations coming over from Delta and how those expectations may have changed. Finally, we talk about George's vision of the future of aviation, including his perspective on advanced air mobility. By way of background, as I mentioned, George is Wheels Up CEO and was a longstanding member of the Delta Board of Directors. He previously served as a partner and co-head of the Global Industrials Group in investment banking at Goldman Sachs from 2002 to 2012, during which time his responsibilities included oversight of the transportation and airline practices. George holds a Bachelor of Science degree in electrical engineering from Duke University and an MBA from the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania. George, thanks for a great discussion and a fresh perspective. And to our listeners, we hope you enjoy our talk with George Mattson as you profitably innovate in the vertical space.
This episode of the Vertical Space podcast is brought to you by Avionics. Avionics is the leader in low size, weight, and power certified avionics for manned, unmanned, and advanced air mobility aircraft. Let Avionics help you achieve your goals, whether that be type certification, airspace access, or beyond visual line of sight operations. Avionics has certified and certifiable communications, navigation, and surveillance avionics for your aircraft. So head over to uavionics.com or Google it to see how you can start flying safer and move your platform forward into shared airspace.
Hey, George Mattson, welcome to the Vertical Space. It's a great honor having you with us.
Thank you, Jim. It's great to be here.
All right. So our first question, which we ask all guests, is there anything that very few in the industry agree with you on?
Well, it's a great first question, Jim. Hopefully they get easier from here. But, I would say that we are I'd say disrupting some norms and changing some ways people think about our industry, that being private aviation. We're trying to make private aviation more sensible to people, more understandable, more accessible. When you think about the partnership that we've announced and are executing an important plan around with Delta Airlines, it's about this idea of providing customers with aviation solutions. Aviation solutions that span across commercial and private. If you think about the industry, sort of since the beginning of time, when that first airplane rolled down the dirt runway in Kitty Hawk, private aviation and commercial aviation have existed in entirely separate ecosystems. And there's a certain segment of common customer we have that accesses both modes of transportation. So why have these things existed entirely separately? And when you think about private aviation itself, one of the things that really attracted me to this opportunity was the lack of innovation that our industry has really, I think, been guilty of for many, many years. If you look at private aviation, it's kind of looked about the same for the last 20, 30 years, which is to say the vast majority of aircraft are still wholly owned by corporations and individuals, and those that are not wholly owned, the vast majority of that subset is fractionalized. Now, what is a fraction of an aircraft? It's a hammer and everything's a nail, right? It's let me buy a piece of an airplane that I will use for all of my private aviation needs. I will use it a fixed number of hours per year for multiple years in a row. I will use it on every trip, whether it's a trip from New York to Martha's Vineyard or a trip from New York to Los Angeles. And I'll be sort of beholden to this tool in my toolkit. Well, we're trying to build an entire toolkit for people, a toolkit that spans across commercial and private aviation, within private aviation, from turboprops to transcontinental or global jets, whether it's on my fleet or not on my fleet, asset light charter. And this mindset of trying to really give customers the tools to choose how they fly private, I don't think is something everybody agrees with me on today, because it's not how the industry is currently structured, but it's where we're trying to take things.
I like that. It's a fresh approach. So it's kind of the merging of the commercial with the business aviation. And you kind of have to ask yourself, why hasn't it been done in the past?
Yeah, look, I think it's hard. I think what we're trying to do is hard, and it's disrupting norms. Look, as a company, it's easier, frankly, to sell a piece of an airplane and have my customers expend the capital for that. This more customer-centric approach and model is hard to do. We believe it's doable, but it took somebody to sort of step in and try it. And we, I think, along with the best partner we possibly could have asked for in Delta Airlines, we think are the right two companies to try it. Wheels Up has had a long heritage of being innovative and disruptive in the space. And we're really just taking that in a new and different direction, but with the same mindset of customer centricity and really driving a solution that puts the tools in the hands of the customer to decide how and when they want to use it and how often.
And so just to understand, George, the contrarian view here is in a different perspective on the customer and the customer experience, or is it in the business model?
Well, I think ultimately the whole goal here is to attract more people to our industry. Some studies have been done that suggest that the vast majority of people, and I've heard a number as high as 90% of people who can afford to fly private have never flown private. And so if that's true, why is that? And I think the answer is that to this point, accessing this industry is a little confusing. Who do I work with? What do I do? Am I really a private aviation prospect or a customer? How do I integrate this into my travel patterns? Am I really ready to go from not flying private to a very broad and expensive approach? And where are those people sitting today? Well, I think they're sitting in the front of the cabin at places like Delta Airlines and elsewhere. And it's not binary. It's not either or. We're trying to introduce the idea of sensible private aviation travel. And those are two words you don't often hear in the same sentence, but there are use cases and trips where it makes sense to select a private aviation alternative for certain customers, whether those are leisure trips or business trips. There are certain trips that make more sense than others. I'm sitting here in Atlanta in our global headquarters and operations center. If I needed to go to New York tomorrow and Delta has 15 flights to New York and I'm by myself, well, why not fly Delta? Of course, we're happy to take you. But if instead I'm traveling with my management team and I'm going to visit customers, operations, plants, investors, and I can make a 5-day trip into a 3-day trip. If I need to go to Europe, and instead of getting off Delta One and getting onto a European commercial carrier and trying to figure out how to get all over Europe for a few days, why don't I go down a set of stairs for that last mile of the trip to be efficient and shorten that trip by 2 days? If I have a home in a place that's going to take me a connection or two to get to, and I can extend my family vacation by 50 or 100% in terms of my amount of time. So we're trying to get people to really think about cost benefit around private aviation as well. And in that sense, we're trying to create a framework that I think people really haven't thought of in this way before.
I like it. I like the overall aviation solution. And I like the idea that, yes, they've always been two different worlds. Why not bring those worlds together? And to some degree, we'll talk about this later, but to some degree, that's what some of the airlines are trying to do with advanced air mobility as well, create this more complete solution. And
Yes.
obviously, Delta has talked about that too. The other thing that's really intriguing, and we'll talk about the Delta relationship later, but you introduced it very early on as part of the solution. I mean, they have an enormous number of people who potentially could fly as well. And Ed Bastian has talked about the passengers that they have who could access the Wheels Up experience. What a tremendous competitive advantage you have there.
Yeah, Jim, on that point, I mean, among the many things that got me very excited in taking on this role from a strategic point of view, as I just described, I think from a purely commercial lens as well, we just have an enormous opportunity working so closely in partnership with Delta. You think about our company today, we have about 10,000 customers. About 5,000 of those are members flying programmatically in the US on our owned operated fleet. And about 5,000 of those customers are global charter customers. You start thinking about the Delta addressable market. Delta has about 45,000 corporate customers. Many of those customers already fly private, some don't. But obviously with Delta's support and given Delta's important relationship with those customers, we're going to have a real advantage in engaging with those 45,000 customers and adding them to our mix of 10,000 customers today. And then you go from the corporate side to the leisure individual side. You think about the Delta SkyMiles program. Delta has about 20 million active members of their SkyMiles program. And so if you and we've done some data work that's more precise than this, but if you just took a swag and you said, okay, let's say 0.5% of those 20 million people are private aviation, either existing customers or prospects. Well, that's 100,000 people. And so I look at these numbers and I'm thinking the corporate side is 5x the size of my business. The leisure side is maybe 10x the size of my business. I've got lots of opportunity to weave this together with Delta in a way that is understandable and compelling to those customers.
And we'll talk more about the Delta Wheels Up integrated experience, but there will be a day potentially when somebody's on the Delta app, and you and have talked a little bit about that being an integrated experience.
Yeah, I mean, if you go back to the whole sort of central notion that we're really trying to drive our strategy around, it's customer centricity. And it's really giving the customers the widest array of accessible, seamless, integrated choices on how they travel, not for every trip, but trip by trip, which is how people want to choose how they travel. And the broader we can make that ribbon, Jim, from obviously, turboprop aircraft to Delta A350s to every private aviation aircraft in the world available to us through charter. Also, you're commenting on something that applies to the Uber partnership that Delta recently announced, the Joby partnership. You start weaving this together and then you start thinking about an end state where it's all tech enabled, right? Where if you are one of those customers who has been identified as a joint customer or a joint customer prospect of both companies, you'll go on the app, whether it's the Delta app or the Wheels Up app, and you'll type in 2 city pairs. By the way, in the real end state, when you start thinking about Uber and Lyft, maybe you're typing in 2 addresses, not airports. But let's stick with airports for now. You type in, I'll pick 2 names, Pittsburgh to Dubrovnik. Well, Delta doesn't fly nonstop or at all to Dubrovnik. You could imagine 2 or 3 options pop up on your app. Option 1 is a purely commercial option, Pittsburgh, JFK, somewhere in Paris or KLM, and then or Amsterdam, and then you take a connecting flight into Dubrovnik on one of Delta's partners. Or maybe you get a second option, which says first leg Pittsburgh to JFK on Wheels Up, down a set of stairs, into a car, onto the plane, and then Delta, and maybe the last mile is also on us. But you start to think about permutations, purely commercial, purely private, optimized hybrids, and the data begins to build on the choices you're making and how you make that cost benefit analysis so that you're shown more informed choices, not for everyone, for you, based on your patterns as this evolves. But integrating that tech where we're really delivering it seamlessly and customers are just selecting. And you might select one thing one week and with the exact same set of choices, a month later, select something different because every trip's different and your emotive state as a customer is different for each purchase. And we're really trying to dive down into that level.
George, look forward to talking more about that integrated solution. If you could, for our listeners, talk a little bit about the private aviation industry, from charter to member programs to fractional ownership to full ownership. Just give a perspective on its size, its makeup.
Sure. Yeah. So I'd start with sort of at the top level, how are all the private aviation aircraft in the world owned or accessed? So the vast majority of private aviation aircraft that exist in the world are still wholly owned by corporations and individuals. If you look at it by number of aircraft or tails, I'll give you an approximate number, but it's somewhere in the 2/3 to 70% range. If you look at it on hours, it's a bit less because those aircraft don't fly as much as aircraft that are fractionally owned or run by operators, which, by the way, tells you that maybe that's not the optimal way to own those aircraft because they're not being fully utilized. So the vast majority are in that environment. When you look at the subset that is not wholly owned, as I was mentioning earlier, the biggest model, the dominant model in many respects, is the fractional model. And so, we estimate that about 2/3 of the aircraft that are not wholly owned are fractionally owned. And then the remainder is in on demand. And on demand can consist of two different versions and permutations within that. It can be kind of programmatic membership, like our membership, or it can be purely ad hoc charter. And that's all kind of lumped in as on demand, not fractionalized, not wholly owned. So you kind of ask yourself, is owning your own airplane and your own pilots, your own maintenance, your own hangar, your own insurance, it's a lot to manage, right? It's a lot of fixed cost, optimal, or is fractional, which is basically a timeshare model, right? It's the transaction, just in case your listeners aren't familiar with it, is basically you procure a fraction of a particular aircraft type, and that fraction gives you a certain number of hours per year on that aircraft type. So let's pick an example. A Challenger 300 or a Phenom 300. You're going to pay for the fraction of that new aircraft that you purchased. You're likely never going to fly on that actual aircraft. You're now going to fly on a fleet of those aircraft types. So you kind of buy a new aircraft, and then you fly on the average aircraft in the fleet, which might be 7 or 8 years old. So ironically, you're kind of paying for new and getting lightly used. And then you are entitled to fly a set number of hours per year on that airplane, 100 hours a year, let's say, for 5 years. That plane depreciates, you pay management agreement payments, a variable cost, and then the plane is worth whatever it's worth at the end of that. And obviously the difference is incurred by you as the fractional owner of that airplane. Let's take a hypothetical customer. So you're a person who lives in New York and you have a house in the summer in Martha's Vineyard and you have a house in Aspen in the winter and for parts of the summer. So you're going to be told you need a big airplane to get yourself to Aspen. So you're getting a Challenger 300, 350 because that's the range you need to get you to Aspen. But then you're flying this airplane 80 miles to Martha's Vineyard every summer, every weekend or whatever, and not optimal. Now, if you had the choice of one airplane type for Martha's Vineyard and a different one for Aspen, you'd theoretically be better off. If you weren't sure if you were going to fly exactly 100 hours a year, and some years it might be 50, and some years it might be 200, and some years it might be 0, that's hard to manage. So you ask yourself, well, why would people kind of sign up to this? And I think the answer is that until now, and this is really the space we're trying to move into, until now, there hasn't been a comparable alternative that is as good as these leaders in our industry who primarily focus their strategy around fractional ownership. And that was really the crux of our decision to renew our entire fleet. And last October, as you know, we announced that we were replacing every jet in our fleet with new jet fleet types to us, which are the core of these fractional programs and the go-to aircraft for corporate customers and the most discerning leisure customers, those being the Phenom 300 and the Challenger 300, 350 platforms. And so that gives you a little bit of a sense for what's happening. If you step back and say, how's it likely to evolve over time? I think that as there are more choices in private aviation, you will see some of those 90% of people, Jim, who can afford to but never have, entering the market. That's going to be good for the market as a whole. I think that you will see wholly owned aircraft as a percentage of the total decline over time as other alternatives that are more flexible and less expensive become more, I'd say, fully accepted as the primary way to fly private. And then I think within the operator world, we expect to see tailwinds as we try to articulate to customers the benefits of the more flexible, accessible, less costly model of, with the same level of quality and service, private aviation that we're offering versus the, I'd say, more rigid models of the fractional providers. And so I think those are some of the trends you're going to see. I also think in a market like the one we're in, where there's more macroeconomic and market uncertainty concern, our kind of easier way to access it, we could see some benefit as people think about that more advantageously relative to longer term commitments, more capital intensive commitments of some of the other segments of the market.
George, along that spectrum of full ownership, fractional ownership, all the way down to on-demand charter or even marketplaces, what are some of the companies that stand out as biggest success stories, either financially or otherwise?
Well, look, the industry is largely private, so it's hard to have other than us, but it's hard to have transparency on, financially how folks are doing. But look, I think we have to obviously acknowledge that NetJets, which was a pioneer in this industry and is the largest operator in this industry, does an exceptional job for their customers. And they have a very loyal following, particularly among, I'd say, corporate aviation buyers. Everybody's got a slightly different model. I think FlexJet has a model that's very similar to NetJets in many respects. VistaJet has a model really focused on long-range flying, large aircraft. Their smallest aircraft in their fleet is sort of a super mid aircraft all the way up to long-range transoceanic aircraft. They have more of a membership programmatic model similar to ours, but I'd say at a different point in the spectrum of aviation solutions. We hit those long-range segments of the market with an on-demand ad hoc charter capability. With half of our business, as I mentioned, is global charter, as opposed to owning those assets today. But they all do a great job. I do think there's a pretty significant step down once you get past the big four, which are the three I mentioned plus us. And look, I think we're filling a space that seems to be vacant at the moment, and we're moving from, if you think about the heritage of Wheels Up and the origins of Wheels Up, a domestic membership centric, King Air centric kind of entry point into private aviation. And between the combination of our acquisition and growth of a tremendous global charter business and Air Partner, which we bought 3 years ago, that business is now as big as my member business and gives me the capability to deliver any airplane here in the US or anywhere in the world for my customers. And then you think, of course, about the Delta partnership. And then you think about the fleet announcement, where we're investing a tremendous amount of capital to modernize our fleet to have the best fleet in the industry. We're really moving from domestic, programmatic, turboprop centric to global, solutions oriented, premium. And that is a shift that is a real centerpiece of our strategy going forward.
Okay, George, elaborate on that a little bit more for us. And let's look at it in terms of those big four. How are they playing alongside each other? And where do you see as the most important areas for strategic differentiation?
Yeah. So look, I think first of all, this is going to be a growing industry for a long time. So I think there's opportunities for lots of people to be successful with different approaches and different models. I think that our space really is going to be centered around leveraging and commercializing the Delta partnership, attracting new entrants to aviation, attracting people who value flexibility and accessibility, and are sort of not particularly fond of a ton of rules and restrictions to our model. But look, we're doing something that hasn't been done before, right? There's an education process, there's a messaging, there's a period of time that's required for that to become part of people's thinking.
Right.
We are an example of how we're trying to evolve people's thinking around how they travel is a program we're working on with Delta this summer, where we selected 5 focus cities in Europe with Delta: Athens, Rome, Naples, Nice, and Barcelona. And so if you go on delta.com on the app today, and this is really a step toward that integration I talked about, which will take us some time. If you go on the app today and you buy a Delta One itinerary to one of those 5 cities, you will get a notification when you get your purchase confirmation that will say, if Mr. Berry, if Athens isn't your final destination and you're traveling onward and would like to fly private, click here to be connected into Wheels Up. There are a lot of people flying in Delta One to those 5 cities this summer. We'll see how many trips we ultimately end up booking. But to me, frankly, that's less important than the thousands and thousands and thousands of people who are now clicking, searching, thinking, and maybe they won't do it this trip, but now they're starting to merge in their own minds and integrate in their own minds hybrid aviation solutions between Delta and Wheels Up. And they're starting to say to themselves, well, geez, if I'm spending $50,000 on 5 Delta One tickets to Athens, maybe I should spend $15,000 or $20,000 more to go private from there to my onward destination. The idea that short haul private aviation costs less than long haul premium commercial aviation is another sort of, I think, concept that customers wouldn't really assume or understand. You start to think about how you travel. You start to think about not just staying in the traditional lanes, right? So, gee, I'm going to Greece, so maybe I should go to Mykonos or Santorini, or kind of where everybody's going. Or if you're going to Spain, Ibiza. Well, no, you can go wherever you want. I mean, put a dot on a map and draw a radius circle around that city, that gateway city, and within an hour, for X number of dollars, I could take my family to the next undiscovered place, the next place, the place that's really hard to get to from my home in the United States. And you start to imagine, we like to say in our business, your itinerary is only limited by your imagination. Your destination is only limited by your imagination. If there's an airport there, and there are thousands and thousands and thousands of airports that are not served by commercial air, we can take you there. We did and I think this captures it. We supported a very important charity here in Atlanta focused on pediatric cancer, and we donated a flight to this cause. And the flight was auctioned off at the event. And actually a Delta executive, ironically, ended up buying the flight, which was nice. And so what did they do with the flight? Well, they wanted to take their family to see the Northern Lights. And so they flew our aircraft out of Seattle to a town in the Northwest Territories of Canada called Yellowknife. And they came back with the most unbelievable pictures of the Northern Lights that I'd ever seen. So you start thinking about how you can use this tool to create experiences in what is increasingly an experience-driven economy and society. And the possibilities around the marketing of this get really exciting. And you start being not limited. And look, what I love to sort of with the Delta folks, they have a vast global network, but it's finite. Now it's not finite anymore. It's infinite. Their network is infinite for their customers who can access this capability.
How was the integrated experience that you're envisioning for Europe this summer different than what the Delta private jets would have been?
So Delta Private Jets, the business that Delta owned before it sold it for cash and stock and in the process became an owner to Wheels Up, was a business that Delta actually acquired through the acquisition of a company called Comair that had that business. And Delta built it into a nice business. It was a domestic business. It was a solely managed aircraft business. It wasn't a business that Delta thought they could get to scale as part of Delta, which is why the Wheels Up transaction was so interesting. But there really is no comparison, Jim, because back then, all of what we're talking about, connecting to flights in Europe, and by the way, we're talking about Europe, this could be anywhere, right? I mean, this could be, Africa, Asia, South America. On a personal note, the one vacation I took last year with my family, we went on a safari. My family always wanted to go on a safari. So what did we do? I'm eating my own cooking, right? So we flew Delta to Johannesburg. And then instead of figuring out how to cobble together some commercial flights in Southern Africa, Wheels Up Charter got us a Pilatus. I said, so I want to do 2 things. I want to take my family on safari, and I wanted to go to the most remote beach where we see the fewest people possible. So we flew a Pilatus PC-12, so Delta A350 to a Pilatus PC-12 to a beach in Mozambique to a safari in Botswana back to Johannesburg. So this is possible anywhere really. But that's some of the stuff that we think is out there in the future for us and is going to really capture the imagination of customers.
That's great. What was your favorite part of the safari?
When you're sleeping in the middle of the night and you realize you're not at the top of the food chain anymore, there's lots of memories of that. But it was really an amazing experience for our family.
Oh, that's great. Great example, too, of the integrated experience. So let's talk a little bit about Wheels Up. What was the vision 10 years ago with the democratization of private aviation to today? What was it and how has it changed through the years? And what is it today, the vision for the company?
So look, I wasn't here 10 years ago, so I have to describe it to you as I understand it from the outside in, Jim. But I think, look, the company and the folks that built it had, I think, a really interesting idea around how do we attract some of those 90% of people that we referred to earlier who've never accessed private aviation to be able to access it. And how do they build a brand and a community around that that's exciting and vibrant and youthful. And look, they did a tremendous job. I mean, from basically startup in less than 10 short years, they became the fourth largest operator in private aviation, built a big brand that's really well known, not only here in the US, but also to an extent also around the world. And it was very much, the focus was growth. And by the way, the broader market environment in those days was for companies to focus on growth. And so, there was a focus on growth that drove the company to a very significant position in the industry over a relatively short period of time. When the Delta Wheels Up transaction happened, I remember I came up to Atlanta to sit down with the team and go through it as a board member in the fall of 2019. And the transaction ultimately happened in, I think it was January or February of 2020. And look, the intention was, and we recognized it was a young company, recognized that they'd grown really fast, recognized they needed some probably help to manage that growth operationally. And the intention was to do that. However, this inconvenient thing called COVID happened a month later. And of course, Delta got focused as it needed to on its own plan and its own future in the midst of that unprecedented shock in aviation and in the whole world. And when people started flying again, Wheels Up started growing even faster than it was growing before. And the operational complexity of managing that growth became a challenge. Delta came in as COVID was ebbing to help with management of that process, sent some resources over to Wheels Up, built a plan with Wheels Up to consolidate its operations into a single operating center and a single operating certificate. And then as the COVID bubble and it was a bubble of private aviation, normalized. And by the way, it's normalized to a higher level than existed in 2019 before the bubble. And I think that's because kind of once you try this, you start to realize you probably want to continue to use this, maybe not at the same level, but at some level. Wheels Up ran into some financial challenges, some liquidity challenges that Delta decided to come in and help solve with an investment. And it was an investment process and a discussion, I'll tell you, Jim, that was very different than the first time around, right? The first time around, it was more like we're going to collaborate, we're going to help each other out, maybe there's some synergies. This time, it was an integrated part of the premium commercial strategy going forward. And what had happened at Delta over those 3 years or so had also moved Delta much further away from its competitive set as the premium commercial airline. And their focus on premium had heightened even more. And so this became more relevant just by the passage of time and Delta's own evolution in that intervening period. And so the idea that got me incredibly excited, and I think got Delta incredibly excited, starting with Ed, is the idea that Delta would position private aviation as an extension of its integrated commercial offering. This wasn't something that was off to the side. This wasn't something that was separate. It sits above Delta One. It sits alongside Delta One. It's integrated with it. And we, Delta, would gain a greater share of wallet with those customers who access both modes of travel, commercial and private, and become more relevant to those important customers in the process. And that was what was different. And that is what is different about Wheels Up 2.0. So look, day one in this role, I articulated a couple of really important priorities. And the first one was we are going to be the best run private aviation company in the industry. And we're going to leverage and follow the Delta playbook to do it. You cannot be successful in private aviation if you are not operationally excellent. Safe always, of course, but beyond safe always, operationally consistent, reliable, and delivering a premium experience. If you think about what customers are buying, they're spending a considerable amount of money to buy back their time, to control their itinerary, to arrive when they're supposed to arrive. And you have to deliver that. Like when you fail there, everything else doesn't matter. And so we said we were going to be the best run private aviation company in the industry. I realized day one that even though we still had some work to do operationally, Wheels Up had gotten a lot better than people realized, and perception was lagging reality. So we made the decision to share every quarter our operating statistics, completion rate, on time, et cetera, brand days, which is a new concept we came up with that I'll come back to in a second. And we don't have an obligation to do that in private aviation. The DOT does require commercial airlines to do that, but we chose to do it because I realized that the facts were going to be better than the perception. And I wanted to hold us also to account publicly for delivering improvements there and the concept of continuous improvement. So day one, we said we're going to be the best run private aviation company in the industry. We moved the headquarters from the New York, I'll call it sales-centric office, to the operations center that we had opened a few months earlier here in Atlanta, just up the road from Delta. We operate the entire company now out of the member operations center here, which is a 40,000 plus square foot facility, basically a replica of the Delta OCC, and run by the same individual that ran the Delta OCC for 10 years, my chief operating officer, Dave Holtz. We consolidated, it was up to 7 or 8, I think it was maybe 8 operating certificates into one operating certificate, which is the equivalent of basically running 8 airlines inside of the airline and disparate operating centers around the country. So we moved it all to Atlanta, and we started to really drive this idea that operational performance and getting a little bit better every day, an inch better, is how we're going to run this company. And that is contagious because once that starts, that's a flywheel that actually starts to work in your favor as opposed to working against you every day. I remember in my early days on the Delta board in the early 2010s, if you had said to somebody, hey, do you think we could ever have a day when we had no cancellations? You'd hear the 50 reasons why that was like statistically impossible, right? Weather, air traffic, planes breaking, pilots getting sick and what have you, right? Misconnects. Well, then it happened. And then it happened twice. And at one point, I think Delta was up to like 250 days, what they called brand days per year. Well, I said the same thing to our team here. Hey, could we have a day with no cancels? All the reasons it wouldn't work, right? By the way, this is a very complex business, a lot smaller than Delta, but we have a floating fleet. We don't have a hub and spoke system. We don't have bases. It's not easy. But then we had a brand day, and then we had another one. And so last year, I think we had just under 90 days with no cancellations, and we measure it and we drive it, and we want 1 or 2 more every week, every quarter, and we keep moving that number up. And that mindset, I'd say, didn't really exist here before, and that was really important.
George, I'm glad you brought up COVID because I've always wondered about this. I understand that you weren't with Wheels Up at the time, but when people in private aviation observed wealthy travelers really adopting private as COVID was ramping up, was the expectation at the time that this is a temporary spike in adoption, or was the expectation that there's no going back once premium customers are exposed to this spectrum of private aviation options? And there was still a spectrum of options even then. So what was the expectation? And then why has there been a subsequent normalization back to not quite the levels of 2018 and 2019, but still some people pulled back out of private aviation and back into commercial? What was the reason for it?
Yeah, I think the expectation at the time was that private aviation was going to see a big spike in demand. And so as you think about it also, obviously the commercial aviation industry is much, much larger than the private aviation industry. So you only needed a small amount of commercial aviation to move to private to see a huge spike in that smaller industry base, right? But I think the expectation was, certainly my expectation was, that you would see a period of a dramatic increase in demand, which is what we saw. But then you would see a normalization as the laws of economics kind of apply, where people who were marginal private aviation customers or felt comfortable flying commercial, but not during a pandemic, went back to their prior patterns, but not at the same level. And so I do think we've seen a meaningful move up from today versus 2019, which I think is secular. And then, of course, you had the cyclical pandemic-driven spike. But I do think the pandemic did, I think, change the baseline for the industry. And I think the narratives that we're now talking about on the back of that dynamic are going to continue to move that baseline up over time.
Right. And you would expect that with the influx of customers into private, you would create this virtual cycle where you have a lot greater density in your private network. That would drive utilization, that would drive better economics, ultimately better economics and experience for the customer. And if that's the case, you would expect that the customer would be even more satisfied and stay in private. What ultimately happened to take them back out to commercial?
Well, I think, look, the vast majority of customers who are private aviation flyers fly commercial also. So the vast majority of private aviation customers are customers of both segments. And what you saw was a shift back, but not a complete shift back. The mix shift changed, but it didn't go back to where it was. I think your question around density and utilization is really the core of what's important to build a sustainable and resilient business in this industry. And there's a lot of aviation, and mobility is a very exciting industry, but you really have to set it up for success, and the details matter. The most important factors that drive performance are asset utilization. And what drives asset utilization is density and network efficiency, right? That's why all the commercial carriers have gone to this hub and spoke system, because that's how you maximize utility and that's how you maximize traffic flows and density. Wheels Up, prior to COVID and then through COVID, got a little bit ahead of itself in trying to offer nationwide coverage with every aircraft type in the fleet. And we started to address that by acknowledging and recognizing that our density in the East Coast and in the West Coast and across to both traveling between is quite high. But that in the middle of the country, we had pockets where we didn't have the density to offer a guaranteed programmatic service. Now, it doesn't mean we can't offer service. We can offer it, but we can't offer it on a guaranteed basis. And so that was an important step. If you look at what we did last year, basically revenues were relatively flat through the year. We did grow for the first time in 2 years in the fourth quarter. But on relatively flat revenues, we were able to improve our contribution margins by 18 points. We went from 1% to 19% in 3 quarters. How did we do that? Well, we did that by basically flying the same amount of demand on 25% less aircraft by driving utilization up 32%. And so, that's what I think about when I think about why operational excellence matters, right? You need people who know how to drive those KPIs in this industry in order to be successful. And you're aligned with your customers in that regard, because the more successful you are, as you pointed out, the lower your costs are, the lower your pricing can be, the more customers you attract. It's a very, very virtuous cycle. This fleet modernization strategy that we announced was a really important part of that conversation as well, because one of the things we realized is that with the legacy fleet we were flying, there was going to be a limit to the amount of utilization we could get from those aircraft, given their operating characteristics, their reliability levels, their amount of maintenance they required versus the aircraft we brought in. So what we've done basically is taken our business from 1% contribution margin to 19%. I'd say just running the existing legacy fleet we had better. And the next step change in that is going to be these new aircraft that we're bringing in, which are going to have very different utilization numbers based on much higher availability. And what's interesting economically about that model is if you get a little bit higher yield, you have a little bit lower operating cost, you have higher availability, and you can drive more utilization, the profit per aircraft goes up by multiples, not percentages. And that enables us to drive better pricing for our customers ultimately, because our costs are lower, right?
George, what enabled the higher utilization? Can you speak to that? Because as I understand, this is one of the most elusive aspects of the on-demand air carrier business model. Because of the high cost of the underlying asset and the need to reposition the aircraft and all the empty legs, that unfortunately remains a mirage for many companies. And that's why there haven't really been successful examples of on-demand carriers. And most of them tend to become scheduled at some point, one way or another. So what is it that enabled your higher utilization? And broadly, how do you think about that aspect of the business model?
So the way we drove higher utilization on our legacy fleet was by focusing on those incredibly important small details that drive performance, right? So our maintenance availability on that legacy fleet got a little bit better. Our scheduling capabilities got a little bit better. Our rate of unexpected interruptions, unscheduled maintenance, et cetera, got a little bit better. We designed a network or a system, if you will, that could achieve higher utility. This fleet transition is a process under which we are going to significantly reduce the average age of our aircraft. And we purposely selected two aircraft types in the Phenom 300 and the Challenger 300, 350 that have very high inherent reliability. And there's obviously statistics on all of that you can rely on, and and we're seeing it already with the operation we were already running with those aircraft. But those are very reliable aircraft. And so if you can take your number of your amount of days out of service for maintenance down, if you can take your number of unexpected maintenance events down, if you can increase your cycles per aircraft before it needs maintenance, and you can do all that, that's what drives that equation. And so it came down to aircraft selection, but the aircraft don't run themselves. You then have to figure out how to run this network. And you have to start with a business that's of sufficient scale and density, geographic density, that you have the ability to fly it efficiently. We run about 2/3 revenue and 1/3 reposition, which is pretty good in this industry. So we don't have long, we manage to short repo legs or no repo legs. We also utilize where we need to for certain trips, third-party lift, right? We're not going to fly a plane across the country to pick somebody up if one of our partners can pick them up right there. So we're utilizing all of that capability and technology, some of which is relatively new to this business. We're also thinking about how we can drive more value to customers by offering them better pricing that aligns with what enables us to operate more efficiently. So for example, not too long ago, if you were a customer of ours and you called up and said, I'd like to go from Teterboro to Palm Beach next Wednesday, we'd say, great, sure, Mr. Berry. What time would you like to leave? Well, I don't know, maybe 11. Well, it turns out most of our customers want to fly between 10 and 2 p.m. Hard to drive a lot of utilization if your whole fleet's tied up for that 4-hour window during a much longer day. But if we were able to offer Mr. Berry an 8 o'clock time slot or a 3:30 time slot that costs several $1,000s less, that's a benefit to a customer. Maybe you accept it, maybe you don't. That's up to you. But if that allows us to string 2 or 3 trips together instead of one trip on an airplane, you start thinking about how you drive utilization through that system as well. And we didn't even have the tools to do that. Time of day dynamic pricing, we didn't even have those tools until quite recently. And so that's another leg to the plan that we think is going to drive quite a bit of value.
George, that's terrific. I'm guessing here with the work that Dave is doing with operational reliability, with the work with the utilization, that technology plays a big role. Talk a little bit about the role of technology with this overall integrated experience, improving reliability, improving utilization.
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. The backbone that the company operates with and under every day is a tech-enabled backbone, right? There's a lot of technology underpinning our ability to, schedule and operate 100+ flights a day, and then to problem solve when there's issues around ATC or whatever it might be. And so we do have a very important technology backbone that the operation runs under. We're continually investing in that, as I just described in the example I just mentioned. We also have a very important technology front end with our customers, right? The app, the ability to do things online, and all of that. And that's before you get to forward-looking projects like tech integration with Delta and the rest of it. But yeah, you can't run a business like this without a really strong tech backbone and continually investing in it. And so look, technology is one of the biggest investments we make around here every year.
If we were to walk into the OCC of Delta and to the operations center of Wheels Up, what would be the biggest differences
Well,
besides size?
yeah. Well, the physical footprint would look awfully similar. And the design of the centers would also be remarkably similar. So you would see people in different functions working in different sort of sections of the room: member services, trip support, fleet planning, mission planning, different maintenance, flight ops, pilots. You'd see different sections around the room. And then basically the way we have it set up is as you get toward day of flight, these flights move toward what we call the bridge, which sits in the middle of the room. And we have a duty director who runs the flights of the day, those flights that are operating, and has sort of to his right and to his or her right or left all the key people to solve issues as and when they come up. And so you'll see a lot of TV screens with a lot of statistics on them and different tail numbers, and you'll see maps with airplanes, and you'll see where the storms are, and we're keeping track of everything in that room, basically. And the physical proximity of all the experts we need to run a clean operation is so important, right? The idea that this is an in-person, shoulder-to-shoulder operation where key experts are managing the operation of those flights and the buildup of preparation for those flights, and any problems that emerged scheduling wise or otherwise from certain trips is really important. And having people physically here is just invaluable. And I love that I sit here because I can walk out there any minute, any day. I do walk out there all the time and keep a real pulse on what's happening. There's been a lot of changes, obviously, to the work environment through COVID and post-COVID, but I think we're pretty clear-minded that we all have to be here to make this operation run, and we're having fun here.
That's great. So you articulate a very impressive and inspiring vision for Wheels Up. And it makes a lot of sense, this integrated experience that a lot of the people in advanced air mobility are hoping for an integrated experience with commercial airlines. And some of the commercial airlines have articulated how this could happen. But let's say 5 years from now, you're screaming success. What's going to happen that's going to make it ideal for Wheels Up? One was going to be some of the 90% who are eligible for private aviation start taking private aviation. You're hoping to be able to hook them through the Delta experience. What else is going to happen that's going to enable your success?
Yeah, so look, I think 5 years from now for us, what success looks like is we are a participant in a bigger industry that we helped expand through some of this thinking and some of the offerings that we've talked about. I think in 5 years, success would mean that people who who access private aviation, whether it's occasionally or frequently, think about the industry differently. They think about it as a tool in an aviation travel toolkit that they can apply as they see fit, trip by trip, whether that's, again, a lot or a little, whether they're a big customer or a small customer, a corporation or an individual, where they live in the United States or they live somewhere else in the world. Seeing this idea of a solutions-based approach spanning across private and commercial come into, I'd say, realization, Jim, would be a really important part of what a future success would look like. And we'll be the beneficiaries of that along with others, but we'll be a beneficiary of that. I would want to see customers really having the broadest array of tools and an expanded array of tools in their hands to decide how to engage with us, right? So you mentioned air mobility. You can imagine knitting together more pieces to the ribbon, right? You can imagine a ground transportation element, an urban air mobility element, an eVTOL element, a long-range aircraft element. You can imagine continuing to tighten the seams between these things, right? So how do you tighten the seams between when you walk out your front door to when you get on the eVTOL to when you get to the airport? To how does that experience of, it's the seams that matter. In a lot of ways, you can have all these really cool offerings, but if you can't stitch them together, you start to really lose the value of them. But what is it going to feel like for a customer to walk off of a Delta airplane, go down a set of stairs, get in a car, and within 15 minutes, they're in another aircraft going to their, what's that going to feel like when we really have that on autopilot, so to speak? When people can choose, right? You know what, I'm going to splurge for this next trip, but I don't need to for the one. When they can start to get the power of choice in their thinking, I think we're going to build a lot of loyalty and brand value. So I think that's what success is going to look like.
George, let's say Robert Isom and Scott Kirby are listening to the conversation, and there's some vision there. What would they say to this clearly different approach that Delta's taking to the incorporation of private aviation? What would they like about it, and what would they not like about it?
Yeah. I'm not sure I'm in a great position to answer that, Jim, but I would say I think Delta's in a different position in its own industry than some of the folks you mentioned. I think when you look at on the commercial airline space, the company that has really redefined premium commercial among U.S. carriers, I think you'd have to point to Delta. When you look at companies that have been the most not only commercially but financially successful, you'd have to point to Delta. But then very importantly, Delta has executed over the last 10 or 12 years a really important partnership strategy around the world that is quite differentiated from other carriers. So when you look at what they've done through their integrated joint venture with Virgin Atlantic, with Air France KLM, with Aeromexico, with LATAM, with Korean, these partnerships with a capital P, I would say, are unique to Delta. And so, look, I don't think there are a lot of other companies like Wheels Up that other carriers could attach to. But at the same time, on the commercial side, Delta has a different DNA around partnerships and this idea that, we really invest in partnerships for the long term. We don't kind of keep track of balls and strikes every week, month, quarter. And we ultimately all benefit from the long-term collective success we build is easy to say, but it doesn't happen that often. And I had the benefit of not only seeing it, being part of it, participating in it as a Delta board member for 11 years. And look, the culture of what's inside our partnership, I would say, is going to be, the ideas are interesting, hopefully, and compelling and have a lot of potential. But to realize that potential, you have to have the right set of aligned partners with the right cultural mindset to produce it.
Great, George. Talk a little bit about what it's like to be the CEO of an organization. What's a day in the life of George Mattson look like?
Yeah. Well, I knew I was signing on for a full-time 24/7 job at the beginning, Jim, but certainly I might have underestimated that. I had the good fortune to spend quite a bit of time with CEOs of companies in my career as a banker at Goldman Sachs and then as a board member on different boards, including Delta. And you always kind of think kind of what that job's like, but you don't completely know what that job's like. And there is an intensity to it. There's a kind of breadth to it that definitely involves a learning curve, right? And so I think I came into this role feeling pretty well prepared given my history in aviation, my history as a strategic advisor, a banker, a financier, a board member of Delta, but there definitely was a learning curve. And there's an intensity to it that you have to really embrace and kind of be ready for. And if you do, it's quite intoxicating. It's quite exciting, but you have to get used to it. This may have been a different sort of setup than a lot of other CEO jobs, but there was a clear plan, but there was an immediacy to executing against it. There was a need, I wouldn't say to turn the company around, because I think that kind of misses the mark, but really to transform the company on a very accelerated pace. So a lot of, I think, what I've been trying to do is sort of set the pace and set the priorities and not make it too complicated. Right? This is a pretty complicated business, but I think you really have to distill it down. And I got this advice early in my career from a mentor that I think has really proven valuable to me. Like, you have to know in your mind what the 3 or 4 things that you're focused on are, and you have to drive those 3 or 4 things. And there might be 400
those 3 or 4 things, George, for you?
Well, look, for me, I think I've already talked about a lot of them. For me, it was repositioning the company around operational excellence. It was building on our already strong team to have a truly exceptional team. On that point, I would say one of the things I've learned in my year and a half here as CEO is you spend an enormous amount of time, and it is incredibly important and valuable time, around people and team. And you cannot have the best company if you don't have the best team. And then your job is basically to figure out how to align that team to work together seamlessly as a team and to hit their potential as a team. And so, operational excellence, team, resetting the strategy and really resetting the messaging around the strategy. We're not a King Air company. We're not a member company. We're not a domestic company. We're not a product company. We're a solutions company. And so that was, I think, really important. And then in the first year, it was really putting the pieces in place to set the foundation for what we can build in the future. And so we had to set the pieces, starting with operation and team, and then the strategy, and then the assets, the fleet. And so, we spent a lot of time last year with our board building a multi-year plan, building a fleet plan that supported that plan, putting the economics behind it that supported that those investments were advisable. And so, those are the 3 or 4 things that I try to drive, and I tried not to get overly distracted with other priorities. But there's, every day here is different, but it's an incredibly interesting and exciting industry. I'm blessed to have great partners, great investors, and great people around me. So it's a team effort. There's no doubt about that.
Let's say United Airlines tomorrow announces a relationship with a Wheels Up like organization. Do you sit back and say, yes, somebody is doing
Somebody
what
has
we're doing?
validated our thesis.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Or is it, oh no, not United? Is it likely to happen? And how would you feel about it?
I don't know if it's likely to happen or not. I think it definitely would lend credence to the ideas that we're promulgating, and in that sense, it would be a good thing. And look, I feel good about our hand, and if somebody wants to put forth a similar model, I think we would do okay. We're all pretty competitive around here. I think we would welcome the opportunity to shine.
George, you were a long time on the board of Delta, and you've seen some great CEOs. Forgive me, I think Richard was there during that
Yep,
time.
it was Richard and then Ed. That's right.
I mean, come on, 2 of the better CEOs you'll see anywhere. What are the things you look at that make a great CEO?
I did have the privilege of working with both of those CEOs and learned a tremendous amount along the way. And look, I've known Ed for a quarter century, which must mean I'm getting really old now. And also, as I mentioned, just in my career, I sat in a lot of boardrooms and met with a lot of CEOs in different industries, and you learn different things about each situation and each person, and you try to take something away from those interactions that you can learn from. Look, a lot is said and written about this role and about leadership, but I think there's a couple of things that probably are consistent across the board. One, you need to have a clear sense of where you are and where you're trying to go. You have to have a sharp view on what your strategic focus should be. And I think, to use Delta and Richard and Ed as an example, they chose a path that invested in the idea that airline travel wasn't a commodity, that price wasn't the only thing that mattered, that customers might not even realize it yet. But if given the choice between a premium offering that required that they pay a little bit more for it, they would take that. And I remember some of the early days of that journey, and branded fares and cabin segmentation. And I remember the experiment where we were going to, Delta was going to charge a different price for a middle seat in the back versus a seat in Delta Comfort, and how many people would take that. And what customers started to realize is the behaviors were they picked the lowest cost option first, and then if something would come up and say, well, for $29, do you want an exit? Or and everyone's saying yes. And they started realizing they were training themselves to realize that so you learn a lot, but you have to have a sharp strategic focus. Delta invested in the idea of a premium experience. Ed would tell you the most important part of that experience is the team that delivers that experience, the frontline team that delivers that experience every day. I was on a Delta flight this morning coming in here, and gosh, our flight attendant was awesome. I just remember thinking, this is like the greatest flight attendant I've ever had. And so these people exist, and these people promulgate the brand. So the first thing I'd say, sharp strategic focus on where you're going. So I think we have articulated where we're going. Second, you've got to realize that you've got to surround yourself with the best possible people, and you've got to attract those people, and you've got to attract them. Look, everyone wants to do well financially and everything else, but you really ultimately want to attract them with a shared vision of where you are going and an excitement about being part of that journey and really buying into that, because you can't create passion with money. And you can't create passion with expanded roles or promotions. People need to believe it. And I think when you have that alignment of your team, and look, here we have just over 2,000 people. Delta has 100,000 people. But I give Ed and Richard and the Delta team tremendous credit for having extended that passion for what they do all throughout 100,000 people. Imagine that. Third, I would say And I learned this a while back, and it's a journey I think we all go through in our careers. Early on in your career, you're trying to be competent, smart, convey what your capabilities are. You do a lot of talking, maybe a little bit less listening. I've learned how important listening is. You have to listen. You have to hear, by the way, which is different than listening. You have to hear what's being said, and maybe you have to hear what's not being said. And you have to know which questions to ask and how to ask them. And maybe you don't want to tell the team where we're going. Maybe you want to hear 4 or 5 views on it, even if you already know where you think you want to go, because the process of how you get to decisions is as important as the decisions. But at the same time, you need to provide direction. And so there's this, kind of never-ending balance in how to move the company and the team in the direction you think you should go. And by the way, I use the word think because all you ever do is spend time thinking about it, right? You never, it's dynamic, and you never are 100% locked in to one idea, one approach. And I think if you're good at this job, you need to be constantly testing your own assumptions, testing other people's assumptions, testing the plan, listening to customers. The other thing I'd say is I try to spend as much time as possible with customers and in my operation with people who don't work for me. And because you learn a lot talking to a pilot, you learn a lot talking to a salesperson, you learn a lot talking to a maintenance tech, you learn a lot talking to a customer. And so I try to be as outward facing as possible in that regard. And I learn the most about what we need to worry about in those conversations, not in the buttoned up meetings where we're all talking here in the headquarters about a particular topic or a particular priority.
Can I follow up on this real quick, George, on the conversations and the insights that you're receiving from the customers in particular? Do you have any insight into how much of this segment of wealthy flyers fly in commercial first class or commercial business class as opposed to private? And for those who stay in commercial first or business, why do they stay there? Obviously, they have the wherewithal to fly private as well. And so what kind of value proposition would it take to take them out of commercial and into private? What do they care about?
Yep. So look, I haven't done this segmentation analysis to give you an answer with precision, but what I would say is that we have some customers who fly exclusively private, but the majority of customers fly both commercial and private. And that's not just true of us, that's true of every company in this industry. I was with one of the leaders at one of the other very big private aviation companies, and I heard the same thing. 70%, of their customers fly both commercial and private. Now, that might mean 9 out of 10 commercial flights are private. It might mean 1 out of 10 flights are private. It might mean 5 out of 10. It's different for every person. But I think the answer as to why goes back to the fact that, look, this is a very expensive way to travel. Notional dollars, this is an expensive way to travel. And if you travel a lot, every trip may not either be possible to be a private aviation trip nor need to be a private aviation trip. And so, I think what most customers try to do is optimize their budget, if you want to call it that, for private aviation across those trips that matter the most. Some customers have an unlimited budget. Wherever they need to travel, they're flying private. Most customers have some kind of a budget, an hour's budget, a dollar's budget. I'm willing, if I'm by myself, to take this trip commercial, but when I'm traveling with my family and my dogs and my whatever, I don't want to connect. Everyone has their own paradigm for how they define the cost benefit analysis. And we think that's okay. We like that. That's how it should work. Again, back to sort of these differing models, that is not really how the other models work. They don't really give the customer that ability to make that choice. And by the way, the choice might be different this year, this month, this week, this trip. People's circumstances change. People, start out flying a little bit of private and then they start flying a lot more private. Some people fly a lot and then something changes and they fly less. Their view of the value of it, the value proposition evolves. What I love about the question or the idea is it's not a one size fits all definition. Each individual human being gets to decide that for themselves. And we want to meet them in a place where we give them the ability to do that. And if we're the company that gives them the ability to do that, then I think we're going to win more customers, all things being equal.
Most people are not aware of the risks of many different parts of private aviation, depending on who you're flying and where you're flying and the like. And I think that's one of the reasons sometimes you'll see people fly commercial is that there's far less risks on certain flights, distances, airports. I think that is one part of the wheels up, that the closer you get to Delta, and
Yep.
the operational performance of Delta. And with people like Dave Holtz on the team, leading the operations, it helps to reduce
Lee
that
Moak
risk.
and Lee Moak running our safety committee and on my
Right.
board. Exactly.
It
Yep.
helps to reduce the inherent risk of private aviation. And I think that could be an exciting part of your future, and you guys articulate it well. All right, so you've been the co-head of the Global Industrials Group at Goldman. You've been on the board with Delta. What do you see as the future of aviation for our listeners?
Look, I think the future of aviation in general is very, very bright. I think that, there are still many, many, many millions of people around the world who have never been on an airplane before. As the world at large continues to build middle classes and wealthier classes, and you see developing economies become developed economies, I think you're going to continue to see a long, multi-decade secular tailwind behind aviation and travel, which really is travel. I think will continue to drive industry growth. When you think about one of the, I think, byproducts, which a lot's been said about already of COVID, is this idea of experiences mattering more than products or goods. And I think that's when you think about some of the trends in younger generations, I don't see that changing for the foreseeable future. I think people are willing to spend a lot more money on a trip of a lifetime with their friends and family than on a new watch or a new pair of shoes. And so I think that share of wallet will continue to increase as well. And as technologies enable people to travel longer distances more efficiently, more cost effectively, in a more elevated experience, which is kind of where all of aviation is moving, both private and commercial, it's going to attract more participants and a larger share of wallet. So I think the future is very bright for aviation. I think connecting the world is something, and being connected to the world is something people inherently want. And I think that's what we are going to see in the future is continual growth. I mean, ultimately tied, I'd say to the wealth effect, the growing of middle classes around the world and here in the US, and accessibility. But I think this industry is going to continue as it has to grow at a higher rate than GDP.
George, a question on advanced air mobility. How did your view of, let's say, Joby-like organizations, how has it changed over the last 5 or 6 years? And how does it changed with your running Wheels Up?
Yeah, I think there's a really important place for short distance urban air mobility in the ecosystem. There are companies today, well, you didn't mention this as part of my background, but one of the businesses I invested in shortly after leaving Goldman Sachs was a company called Tropic Ocean Airways, which flies amphibious seaplanes, wheeled and amphibious, but mostly amphibious seaplanes in Florida, to the Bahamas, in the Bahamas, and then in the Northeast, in particular from New York City, East River, to the Hamptons in the summer. And so, you think about urban air mobility, whether it's helicopters or seaplanes or eVTOLs, these cities around this country have been, are now megalopolises, right? They're impossible to get around. Getting from one end of LA to the other end of LA could take you half a day, right? And so this idea of short distance, I think, has a real place and future. Whether the technology, when I should say the eVTOL technology is commercialized, I think you'll see a step change growth in that. But you think about, cities and the surrounding areas, and how do we make 40-mile, 50-mile, 60, 80-mile trips possible, which could take hours and hours in a car, and there's really no commercial service available today, obviously. I think it gets exciting, and I think those are going to be opportunities for companies to take advantage of going forward. And I think that there's going to be opportunities, as Delta is already doing through its partnership with Joby, to connect those customers to commercial aviation and to private aviation in the future, right? We have thousands of flights a year that leave from the New York City area, and people are spending a lot of money to get on those flights. And to get to the airplane at the airport, they're getting in a car and spending a couple hours trying to get across the GW Bridge or whatever. This there's going to be better ways to do that going forward. There already are, but it's going to get more and more, I'd say, available.
Are the changes in the economy and the introduction of the tariffs recently, is it helping, hurting, or are you unfazed by it at Wheels Up?
Well, I would say macroeconomic and market uncertainty is certainly not helping, but we sit in a sort of place in the value chain and in the customer segmentation chain that is, I'd say, somewhat resilient to macroeconomic and market shocks. Certainly, I think what the commercial airlines have seen in terms of headwinds over the last couple of months, we have not seen. We do have, but at the same time, we're not immune to it. So I think we're resilient to modest shocks to the system, deterioration, but more pronounced shocks or shocks that last a period of time. History would tell you that this industry definitely sees the impact of that as well. We're not seeing that at the moment, but we're watching it, obviously.
All right, I'm going to ask Luca and Peter a question. How has your perception of Wheels Up changed based on our conversation with George?
I guess my perception has changed in that the Wheels Up strategy is based on expanding the set of users of private aviation and sort of slingshotting off of the collaboration with Delta on this. But as you move into trying to attract that new set of users, it's pretty complicated to sort of sort through and parse through those customers of Delta who are sitting in first class, their reasons for doing so, and the particulars of the value proposition that you can use to get them engaged with flying private, because it might be a really different value prop than the people that are already using these types of private charter services. And so, where do you find the data? How do you look at the available data to understand behavior to pitch these people in the right way at the right time? That's an interesting question.
I'm inspired by your vision, George. I think I read everything I could have read about you, about Wheels Up, about Delta's relationship. I think you've articulated a very compelling vision. I know the hard stuff is getting revenues up and getting your contribution margin up and getting to profitability faster. But I'm inspired by it. And I would assume the CEOs of the advanced air mobility companies listening would say, go. Wheels Up, be successful. Your success means their success in some ways, right? That integrated experience is very important to them as well. All right. So, is there anything else that we haven't asked you, George, that you were dying to say?
I think you've asked me all the right questions, and this is usually not the case, but I can't think of anything else I would want to add at the moment.
Okay.
But I probably will think of something when I hang up. So
George, a real honor to have you on. Thanks for joining us. Great conversation.
appreciate it. Thank you guys very much.
All right, that's a wrap for today. Thank you for listening to the Vertical Space podcast. Reach out if there are topics that you would like us to discuss, and goodbye until the next episode. Unless mentioned, this podcast is in no way endorsing or promoting any person and/or company mentioned, and all opinions within the podcast are solely that of the presenters. The Vertical Space makes no guarantees, warranty, or representation of any information given in this podcast. Any information given is for informational purposes and should be used at your own risk. This podcast is for general, educational, and entertainment purposes only.